The speaker today, keynote speaker, Professor Stephen Billett, is, as you can see, from Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia, and I have the pleasure to introduce him a little bit. He's the Australian Research Council Future Fellows from 2011 to 2015. He's the editor-in-chief of Vocational Learning. He's a professor for adult and vocational education at the School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith University. And he has been quite impressive resume because he has worked as vocational educator, educational administrator, teacher educator, professional developer, practitioner, and also as policy developer. And his research is about learning through and for the workplace, and we thought it would be a great idea to have him as a speaker because he combines those two pillars that we are setting up in EAPRIL to work this year. So I'm really happy to give the floor to you, Stephen.
Hope that's not bad luck. What I thought I would do is address fairly centrally the relationship between work and learning. And I want to build a case. And the case is that learning experiences in workplaces make distinct or particular kinds of contributions to individuals' initial development of their occupational skills, and also that development across their working life. And I think to exploit this, to capture it and utilize it fully, we need a comprehensive account of workplace learning and to understand the various contributions that support it. And I think this account needs to be informed by, but not constrained by, the educational discourse, and certainly the discourse of school societies, which I argue limit how we look at how people can learn through work. And such an account likely has three dimensions: practice curriculum, practice pedagogies, and also the importance of learners' personal epistemologies. And sitting within all of this and foundational to it, I hold, is the importance of mimetic learning. The processes of observation, imitation, rehearsal, practice, and introspection on what is done. And of course, imitation within the educational discourse is often seen as being low ordering of learning, but in fact it appears to be anything but that. I draw upon two broad bodies of work. The first one is the empirical work I've done into how people learn through work in the last 20 or so years, and also more recent work which draws upon historical and anthropological accounts of how people learn cultural practices outside of educational settings. But before I engage in that case building, I'd like to advance a series of premises which help, I guess, which help me understand how people learn through work. Firstly is that when we engage in any activity, for instance work, we're also learning. There's no separation between the task of engaging in work and when we learn. The process of learning is not some hybrid process, I'm learning now, I'm learning now, I'm learning now, but rather it's a constant process that occurs as we construe what we experience and we construct meaning and other things from what we experience. So at the first level, learning is ongoing through our lives, and there's nothing particularly special about it. The second point is that when we engage in work activities, we're also actively remaking culture. And that is that when we engage in our work activities, addressing problems at a particular point in time, to address particular kinds of goals and to meet particular imperatives, we're actually remaking occupations. And sometimes we transform those occupations. Just think what's happening now in hospital systems across the world as people are learning how to engage with Ebola. The previous hygiene protocols have been cast aside and new practices are being developed. So the whole care of patients there is being transformed, for instance, through nurses and doctors' everyday practice. But this knowledge that we need to learn, occupational knowledge, does not come from within us. It comes from outside of us. It arises through history, culture, and is manifested in particular situations where practice occurs. This means then that we need to engage with that knowledge and interact with it and learn from it, access it and learn from it. And the term I use there is interpsychological. That is between the person and the world beyond them. And that rich learning isn't dependent upon whether it occurs in a workplace or an educational institution, but most likely on the one hand, the kind of interactions and activities which people engage in, and on the other hand, are invited to engage in, and on the other hand, how people elect to engage with the particular activities that they're offered. And in that sense, there's a combination of experiences that are provided, and then the experiencing of those by the person. But most importantly, the relationship between the two. Quick note, by the way, I'm going to make this PowerPoint accessible to the conference organisers so you'll be able to get copies of it. So these are some premises which help me think about this issue of the relation between learning and work. In terms of progress, how I'd like to progress is firstly talk about learning through work, its central role for humanity, then try to provide some explanatory accounts of that learning, refer to the limits of the educational discourse in actually engaging and understanding how we understand the learning through work, and then some recent accounts from history and anthropology which, combined with other work, perhaps suggest that there's three dimensions to an account of learning through work, comprising practice curriculum, practice pedagogies, and epistemological practices, how people go about engaging with it. And then some implications for developing occupational capacities in workplaces, and that'll do us. So, learning through work. It's the most common and sustained mode of learning occupations across human history. In essence, we would not be here today if the vast majority of human learning associated with occupations had not occurred through work. It's been central to humanity and central to human progress. Humans have lived in settled communities for about 10,000 years and in cities for about 5,000 years. That has required those communities to require complex forms of knowledge, means of engagement, and the rise of a set of occupations which serve human needs. Now, if we look at this artifact here, and I've got another version on the screen here for those of you at the back. This is a highly intricate bit of technology here, La Regla. And if we scale this from 10,000, or let's say 5,000, to the yellow and pink bit on the end there, this is the period of time where we've had educational provisions for occupations, about 200 years. But what's happened in the past? Do we believe for a minute that across this time in human history that somehow rich knowledge wasn't developed, innovations didn't occur, conceptual knowledge wasn't founded and developed? Do we believe for a minute that humanity had to have a collective moratorium across this period of time until finally we reached the point where we could go to a Wappenschulen, HBO MBO, an FE college, a TAFE college? I don't think so. And already in this period of time here, we're realizing that the provisions of educational experiences in educational institutions alone is not sufficient, that we need to provide practice-based experiences. But one of the problems with this little period of time here is that all of us have grown up in a school society where the precepts and values of schooling come to predominate. And so we find it difficult to understand and depart from that in understanding how learning occurs outside of education institutions. And so there's this curious litany of terms used: informal learning, non-formal learning, semi-formal something learning, which I think lays naked, in some sense, that lack of appreciation of learning through practice. It would seem that similar processes occurred in Europe and Asia, and that family and local workplaces were the site of most of that learning before the various industrial revolutions occurred in Europe, India, Japan, China, etc. And that certainly there was engagement with the master, but there's actually very little evidence of teaching occurring. In fact, it's possible to make a case that the thing that we call teaching is only a period of this time here. That if you look at some of the ancient educational institutions, such as the madrasas of Central Asia, you find that teaching didn't occur, as we know. Students were sent off to study individually and then engage with the teachers when they experienced a problem, an issue that they couldn't address. The same in Hellenic Greece, for instance, and other places. So this period here might also be the genesis of this thing called teaching. And that the vast majority of this learning appears to arise through the process of mimesis, observation, imitation, practice, and introspection on it. And that is, rather than a teaching process, it's actually a learning process. As Bridget Jordan, in referring to how Mexican birth carers learnt, whatever the origins of the didactic mode, it's always been a milder mode of knowledge acquisition in our evolutionary history. In the West, however, the didactic mode of teaching and learning has come to prevail in our schools to such an extent it is often taken for granted as the most natural, as the most efficacious and efficient way of going about teaching and learning. This view is held despite the many instances in our own culture of learning through observation and imitation. Singleton, who looked at the development of pottery skills in Japan, came to a similar conclusion. It's expected that serious learning will proceed unmediated by didactic instruction. Miriam Kuki describes an education which relies upon the principles of learning observation and refers specifically to apprenticeship education. Yet it is the apprentice who has to understand this. That is, the apprentice needs not only to learn the skills, but also to learn their role as an active learner. But let's take an example to elaborate this richness of the work and learning. China is the longest continuous culture and has a form and a characteristic of skilled work in its ancient times which is quite distinct from that in Europe for very good reasons. However, it would seem similar learning processes occurred. As a schoolboy in Britain, I learned that the Normans invaded Britain in 1066, and in 1085 they did a stock take. The stock take came down, it's called the Doomsday Book. And the Doomsday Book suggested that the Normans had got themselves about 1 3/4 to 2 million very unhappy British people. Good luck to them. At that time, Norway had a population, for instance, of about 80,000. At that time, China's population was somewhere between 110 and 118 million. It was a highly organised society. It had cities, for instance, that had street lighting, articulated water, toilets, and it had a very complex social and organisational structure. It was a complex and sophisticated society. Just this figure I would like, the Chinese census in 82 suggested the Chinese population was 57,671,400. Don't you love it? And AD 2, and they came up with a figure, great. In 1085, the year that the Doomsday Book was published, the government mint in China it's estimated to produce 6 billion coins a year. Just think that one through. 6 billion coins a year. That's one of the coins they produce. And if you look at the design of the coin is designed for symbolic purposes, but it's also got production at the heart of it. There's places for the metal to run into the mould, and the square in the middle is part of the manufacturing process. They're put on a square rod, and the surplus metal is filed away after. This is one of the 3 methods that was used to produce those coins. And 1114, they were printing money. So forget Gutenberg, these folk got there a couple of centuries beforehand. And this is the money they printed. Such was the demands of the printing of the making of the coins, as you can well imagine. I mean, it's not just the skill of doing it, but the entire structure that comes around that of producing the metal, the charcoal, the distribution of the coins, etc. So they decided to print money. And in doing so, they closed 50 copper mines. So the requirements for mass manufacturing arose in China far earlier than everywhere else. And there's a great book by a German called Liederoth, who's written about the way that a modular system was developed early on. And think IKEA, the way that everything fits together, the flat pack stuff, was all manufactured. This was because this was all about mass manufacture. However, this was long before this, beg your pardon, starting in the Shang Dynasty, which was famous for these large bronze urns, then to the Zhou Dynasty, there's an example of some blades, molds for knife blades here, and into the Qin Dynasty, there's a crossbow trigger here which had 3 working parts, was highly intricate, and this era produced mass coins and drainage pipes and arrowheads and tiles for the roof, etc., etc. And into the Tang Dynasty, which was famed for its high levels of craft with porcelain. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. So between the Shang and the Qin Dynasty, there was a movement from craft to industrial production, which then led into the Ming Dynasty. And you're all familiar with this type of pottery, and just again to get the sense of industrial scale, that the kilns at Xinjiang, which is the source of this beautiful white kaolin they make the pottery out of. In 1577, you can see the size of the sets that were made there, of 96,500 small pieces, 56,000 large pieces, and 21,000 items for sacrificial purposes. And these sets all had to be intricate, they had to be the same, and if they weren't the same, they were destroyed. And then in the 18th century, beg your pardon, China exported across the world these forms of pottery from Xinjiang. And as most of you are aware, these were then borrowed by the Dutch from Delft, and also the British, Staffordshire, copied these designs. The British used the kaolin from Cornwall. For the last 40 years, I think I've been eating my muesli out of a bowl, which comes from this tradition. So, all of this innovation, all of these skills that underpin this incredible achievement arose through work. As I said, there weren't the Fachhochschulen, there wasn't the MBOs, the HBOs, the TAFEs, the FE colleges. They weren't part of this system at all. It might be tempting for people in the audience to say, oh, well, this is mere production work. But I would suggest to you that we think the analogy of the work that these workers did with a contemporary analogy would be the manufacture of a high-tech plane, because the skills that these people had in producing this were of a very high level. And in China, there was also a very distinct valuing of skills, perhaps unlike Greece, by the way. And there's a parable from a Taoist philosopher whose name I can't pronounce, and he used a parable of a wheelwright, a man who made a wheel, who makes wheels, talking to a powerful general about the importance of personal knowledge and personal knowing. I see things in terms of my own work. When I chisel at a wheel, if I go slow, the chisel slides and does not stay put. If I hurry, it jams and does not move properly. When it is neither too slow or too fast, I can feel it in my hand and respond to it from my heart. My mouth cannot describe it in words, but there is something there. I cannot teach it to my son, and my son cannot learn it from me. So I've gone on for 70 years growing old, chiseling wheels. The men of old died in possession of what they could not transmit. So it follows that what you are reading are their dregs. So the point, and I've given various translations of the word dregs there, by the way, because I wasn't sure if you knew that word. It's the bottom of the barrel. So the point that's being made here is that it's only the forms of knowledge which you can state and put in a book, which are the easy stuff, the unimportant stuff. And I think what's noteworthy in this parable provides a very early example of questioning of the power of declarative knowledge. That is the knowledge you can speak or write down. And declarative knowledge is really the knowledge which is prized and valued most by the educational discourse and educational institutions. So, how did these folk learn this stuff? Little is written about how learning was supported and occurred in these countries. And as the librarian of the Joseph Needham Centre in Cambridge said to me, it wasn't of interest to those who wrote. But certainly, before the era of schooling, institutionalised provisions were limited to a few occupations: medicine, law, military, etc., particularly in places like Hellenic Greece. And even then, practice was still central to it. For instance, in Plato's time, medical education was largely positioning the student to be a bit like a nurse. And the doctor would go to somebody's house, attend to the patient, and often the student was left to look after the patient when they left. And there's reports that rhymes and mnemonics were used in some of these cultures to pass on knowledge. And it's worth noting that in Hellenic Greece, the anatomy class and the textbook were first introduced because medical students were unable to get the extent and kind of practice they required to understand medical knowledge. So because they couldn't get the practice experiences, these two innovations were created: anatomy classes and textbooks. The point being, and the important point being, is that it was a lack of access to practice that led to the formation of these two pedagogic forms, which we're very familiar with now. So what is known about learning through everyday work, including its strengths and limitations? In ancient Mesopotamia, the Talmud suggests that as it is your duty to teach your son the law, teach him a trade. And the tradition was for the son to go to the rabbi's school in the morning and in the afternoon to learn his father's trade. In Hellenic Greece, Plato noted that the son learned his trade by growing up in his father's family and participating in the family activities. This is very gendered stuff, by the way, as you can see. Imitating what he saw his father doing. At first, the imitation would be playful and childish, carried out with such toy tools as a child could handle. Later, it would become more deliberately purposive. Practice produced technical proficiency in details, and the growing boy would act first as his father's helper, and then as his associate, and would eventually himself become the head of family and centre from which further training in the family craft would radiate. Similarly, in ancient India, at sites where pottery was produced, they found tiny artefacts which were had to be made by children's fingers. And the assumption is that these were the children of the potters who were learning how to make pots. Now the point is that when we look at these three examples, what we find is some bases of a curriculum of practice and early pedagogic strategies. Why did the boy go to yeshiva in the morning and engage with his father in the afternoon? It's a bit like sports, isn't it? Do sports in the afternoon and do maths in the morning. So why was that relationship there? And then what we see in the example that Plato gives us is a clear curriculum pathway, a course to follow, a path to progress along, to use the meaning of the word curriculum. And that was a pathway of a person engaging in increasingly more complex tasks, as is the pottery example. We also find that the central role of personal epistemologies comes through in Plato's account, although he didn't use that language, of course. And what Plato in the Republic suggests is that the best physicians are those who have treated the greatest number of constitutions, good and bad. From youth up, they've combined the knowledge of their art with the greatest experience of disease. It is better for them not to be of robust health themselves, but to have had all manner of diseases in their own persons. For it is not with their body, but with their mind, that they cure the body. And thus they infer furtherly bodily diseases of others from a knowledge of what has taken place in their own bodies. So, what do we know from more recent accounts? In the work I've been doing over the last 20 years, looking at how people have learned in a whole range of workplaces and different industries, I conclude that there are 4 key contributions to learning through work. They are these. Firstly, engagement in tasks, just doing it, the engagement in goal-directed activities, which has a cognitive legacy, indirect guidance, the ability to understand what others are doing and form goal states and understand what you need to achieve. The importance of practice, of doing things repeatedly to develop procedural skills, but also in terms of conceptual development to identify causal links and associations between things, and then close guidance of more expert partners. And that is when the knowledge that needs to be learnt can't be done so through discovery alone. That is that there are lots of situations where it's impossible that the epistemological adventures of Robinson Crusoe are going to assist the learning of that knowledge. A couple of observations about that list. The first one is that if you look down the 4 items, really 3 of them are very much premised upon the learner's agency, engagement, and intentionality. And only one is really dependent upon a more informed other. And even then, there's a need for the person to engage with that other. And so the importance of interdependence there it comes out. The learner engaging interdependently, not independently, but interdependently. And then it's likely that the particular utility of these contributions will occur at different points across a worker's working life, depending upon what their learning needs are. There's also a whole series of limitations with learning through practice, and it's important these are articulated. These are some of them: inappropriate learning, lack of access to activities and guidance, not understanding the goals that people try to achieve, reluctance of experts to provide guidance, absence of expert guidance, limits in developing understanding, which is a real issue, and the reluctance of workers to participate in the effortful process of learning. So I think we need to find ways of drawing upon the kind of contributions that were on the previous slide and find ways of minimising or ameliorating these limitations. So the point is, it's not just going to be about engaging in experiences, but we need to organise and enrich those experiences to achieve the kind of goals which require for effective workforces and for people to be highly skilled. So, looking at both the research I've done on how people learn through everyday work, but also when interventions occur in the workplace, as some of you will be aware, I use a framework that is a duality between the affordances of the workplace, what the workplace invites people to engage in on the one hand, and how people elect to engage with what is afforded them. And for me, it doesn't make too much sense thinking about any kind of learning environment, an education institution or a workplace, unless both of these factors are taken into consideration. The kind of experiences that are being provided, but also how people will engage in those. And both of these play out in all sorts of circumstances. So I know in Germany there's a lot of interest in learning through errors. And the same thing applies there. What is the tolerance to errors in the workplace? And will a person actually confess and engage productively in learning from their errors? And then mentoring. Is mentoring supported and respected in the workplace, and how people engage in both the act of mentoring and also being a mentee. So, how do we take these ideas forward? And in doing so, I think it's important to be careful and critical of the discourse of school societies and education, because they're not always helpful. For instance, not captured or articulated or privileged in that discourse are some of the following. Many of the procedural capacities that we need to undertake our tasks simply are not captured in that discourse. For instance, much of the embodied learning that we use to conduct our work that occurs through sensory processes. So, for instance, the midwife here who is listening to the baby's heart using a Doppler scope, she's listening to the birthing mother's tummy, and she's hearing a sound, vavumfa, 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 vavumfa. I hope it's not that, by the way. And she will make a decision upon the health of the fetus's heart by hearing the sound. And then she'll walk over to a table and a piece of paper and write something on it. But she's already made the decision by that time. It's the sound that she's heard. Welders, for instance, welders can't actually see what they're doing, and what they often rely upon is the sound of the weld actually occurring, and they use the sound to determine whether the flow of the weld is being continuous or not. And then there's haptic qualities. On the image here you can see a physiotherapist who feels the body to determine the points of pressures and all those things that physiotherapists do. We're reminded that the planes you flew here in probably all had haptic technology in, and that is that when they removed the direct control between the ailerons and the joystick, and this gave pilots a lack of ability to actually feel for the plane. And so these, as I understand it, most contemporary planes have haptic technology, which brings a sense of feel back into the controls of the plane. Years ago I used to work in the clothing industry, and one thing I would always do in the manufacturing situation is feel fabric. And I would feel fabric in particular for one reason, that I would want to feel it, let it go, to see how much fill was in the fabric. Because that would help me know how the fabric would go through manufacturing. And if there were problems in manufacturing, I would use feel a lot. And I'd also use feel for other things, such as the feel of a fabric for cutting patterns for and stuff like that. So these are important skills. Capacities, as is dispositions. That is the qualities that we would hope perhaps a midwife would have, or the commitment that a young woman who's volunteering for the Singapore Armed Forces and has just completed her basic training is expressing in her occupation or vocation. And these capacities are central to much of occupational performance, yet they're very rarely captured in the kinds of educational frameworks we engage in and the kinds of industry national standards that are used, etc., etc. And part of that is, because they're not measurable. Now, importantly, this is not an anti-educational polemic. What I'm trying to do is make space for a consideration of learning through practice, and I've just been advised here I've got a quarter of an hour to do it in. I think there's three key elements to an account of learning through practice. First, as I've said, curriculum practices, pedagogic practices, and curriculum is a set of activities, and pedagogic practices are the means by which experiences can be enriched, and then the importance of personal epistemological practice, how people engage and learn and make sense. I guess in terms of practice curriculum, there is two broad dimensions. One is simply the immersion of in an occupation, and then secondly is the structuring of experiences. In earlier times when you learned in family, the first one was the one which likely predominates. I could give examples, but it seems I don't have time. But it's more likely in contemporary times that there's deliberate structuring of experiences and the ordering of experiences. And anybody who's read Jean Lay's work knows about the learning curriculum and the progression from activities which have low error consequences through to those tasks that have high error consequences. I haven't got time for examples, that's depressing. But I'll just use one very briefly. This is a small pub in the city of Singapore called Marina Plaza, 1,300 rooms. The young people in Singapore don't want to be room attendants, so they have to bring folk in from Vietnam, Philippines, mainland China, and train them. And just to give an example of a practice curriculum, what they do in this hotel is that the room attendants are prepared in what is referred to checked out room. That is a room where there's no guest in it, they've gone. So they can learn how to make those pillows, get the pillows in very tight, make the room very nice and tidy, etc., etc. And then only once they've got to a certain level of performance, they're then moved into look after rooms which are checked in rooms where they might encounter a client. And part of that issue is that they might not have very good English skills. So an example of a deliberate structuring of experiences is with midwifery training. And midwives engage in midwifery students engage in two kinds of practical experiences. One is which is called a follow-throughs, where they engage with birthing women through the entire prenatal process and immediate postnatal process, and then also engage in clinical experiences. And what's suggested in this diagram here is that the first structuring of experiences should be with the follow-throughs, because that's how they learn about what birthing's like from the birthing mother's perspective. They learn the goals, requirements, they learn the sensitivities, they learn the issues associated with that. And that would seem to be a far more important set of skills before they begin to participate in clinical placements. So that's an example of a curriculum. Now, in terms of practice pedagogies, there's a list of these which come from the anthropological literature, and these are kind of pedagogic practice which be conducted through work, and they each have particular kinds of contributions. Again, I thought I had more time, but I don't have time. So I'll give one example, and this is a rich pedagogic activity. It's a very common one which is used in hospitals, and it's called the nurses' handovers. And what happens at nurses' handovers is the incoming shift of nurses are briefed by the outgoing shift of nurses. And they normally discuss 5 things. Firstly, the patient, who the patient is, how old they are, whether there's anybody at home to care for them, should they be discharged, the condition or conditions of the patient, and the kind of treatment or treatments they're having, and then they talk about how the patient is responding to that, and then they make a prognosis, a judgment of where the patient will be at the end of the shift next week or whatever. And so, as I'm sure you can appreciate, this is a very rich learning experience. It's also a learning experience that learners at different levels of competence can engage in. I've sat in these meetings and can understand some of the concepts, and a more experienced student or a graduate nurse could engage in a very different way in the making of prognosis, etc. There's also this stuff that I've done earlier about how to promote these forms of knowledge in the workplace. And there's personal epistemologies. As I've said, and these are important bases by how people come to know, and they're more than beliefs, they're how we experience things, as I've said, through haptic, sensory processes as well as observation. And this is central to how we make sense of what we engage with and know at work. And central to these are things such as I've referred to imitation or mimetic learning, a process called ontogenic ritualization, where you learn how to engage with others and what is appropriate and not, the active engagement in learning. And it's worthwhile noting here, and I did wish I had more time, that the origins of the word apprenticeship appear to come from the word apprehend. That is, it's the apprentice's job to take the knowledge, not be taught the knowledge. And as I've already foreshadowed, in Japan, the word for apprentice is miniari, one who learns by observation, And then there's this other term called miniari kokuyu, which is unobtrusive process of observation. And the importance of learner readiness and effortful engagement, including a critical one. So what? I guess workplaces are legitimate sites for initial and ongoing learning of occupational practice. Like educational settings, they make particular contributions that need to be utilised and augmented. And they have particular kinds of conceptions of curriculum and pedagogic practices are important, as indeed are the kind of personal practice that people use when engaging in learning. And it's also important to identify how these kind of strategies I've referred to, these approaches I've referred to, will be appropriate for particular kinds of learning, for particular occupations and for particular workplaces. And very importantly, we need to position learners as being interdependent, not independent, interdependent, to engage with others, artifacts, text, etc., to engage in that way. And then finally, an invitation. What I've got here is something called cotton. You all know this stuff, and it comes from something called a cotton boll. Cotton, as you know, came from somewhere over there in Central Asia. When it first came to Europe, it came with the intelligence that this was a vegetable fibre. It was not from an animal. So people in Europe began to think, well, what kind of plant is this? This is called the vegetable land of Tartary. And this is what people with their existing knowledge of where fibre like that came from imagined this plant would look like. Now the point I'm trying to make here is that because we all grow up and have experiences and are very much part of the school society, we might minimise the importance of learning arising outside of education institutions. Our discourses, the way we think about it, the way we engage it, may be far poorer for it. So my invitation is for you to think differently, a little bit, about how people learn through work, and not simply apply the educational discourse and the discourse of school societies in understanding that kind of learning. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Sorry for rushing you through part of it, but I wanted to open the floor for one or two questions. But keep in mind that there is a question session with Stephen at lunch in a hotel restaurant. So, are there one or two burning questions? Okay.
I'm interested in how you look at assessment in workplace learning. It's a school thing, assessment, but how do they do it in workplaces?
It's a really, well, I mean, can I start something quite different? Isn't it interesting the way that when you go to a school, the first thing you do is you get told what you've got to learn. And increasingly, as that's been highly regulated, you're told this is what you'll learn. Aims, goals, and objectives. And what's really interesting about the tradition of learning through work is it is the learner's job to actually work out what needs to be learned. So it's almost inverted. So the first point is that, in some sense, you could argue we've actually generated a sort of natural association between assessment and learning by predefining what people will learn. And increasingly, in vocational education and professional education, that defining of pre-specified learning outcomes is done a long, long way and very remotely from the places where performance occurs. And my view is there's no such thing as an occupational expert, that you're an expert in terms of where you actually practice. Because, you know, for instance, being an expert nurse is one thing in a major city hospital, it's quite another in a small rural community, for instance. So in terms of assessment, I think it's helpful to actually privilege the workplace in terms of the knowledge that needs to be learned. And I would do that through a two-tier system, and that is, first of all, whatever the occupation is, there will always be the canonical knowledge of the occupation, the kind of knowledge that a nurse, a doctor, a hairdresser needs to know, but also some acceptance that how that knowledge and practice is manifested in a particular situation is important to assess, because that's how the person engages, and look at the relationships between the two. In terms of the actual processes of assessment, I think it's a question of processes, of following a person over time and taking different measures of how they perform. One of the most first things that we need to assess people in the workplace is for safe working. And I would defy anybody to assess a person on safe working using, for instance, behavioural objectives and behavioural measures, which is the common practice in vocational education. But rather something like safe working needs to be assessed over a period of time, not as a single incident when somebody's being observed by somebody in a checklist, for instance. So for me, perhaps there's the thought of inverting some of this stuff and thinking differently about assessment, not necessarily being pre-specified learning outcomes, but the end of a journey for the learner. And then there's the processes by which that might happen.
Okay. Any other questions you may ask Stephen during lunch? Thank you very much for your attention, and Stephen, thank you very much for this wonderful keynote.
Thank you.